So Washington collected a fortune in tariffs and then had to start giving it back. More than $175 billion in tariff revenue was suddenly exposed to refunds after the Supreme Court ruled that emergency economic powers did not authorize the administration's sweeping import taxes. In June alone, the United States returned $49.2 billion to importers, collected only $23.6 billion in gross customs duties, and recorded a net tariff loss of $25.6 billion. Economic research found that American companies and consumers carried nearly 90% of the increased burden. Meanwhile, Canada reduced its dependence on the American market, lowering the U.S. share of its merchandise exports from 75.9% to 71.7%. Ottawa committed $6 billion to ports, railways, Arctic infrastructure, and overseas corridors. And Washington, despite applying pressure for more than a year, was still publicly complaining that Canada had not offered meaningful concessions. That is the tariff trap. If the tariffs remain, American companies continue paying them while Canada finances alternatives. If they rise, the domestic burden becomes harder to conceal and foreign suppliers redirect more trade. If they fall, Washington loses revenue, negotiating pressure, and the political claim that tariffs were producing victory. And if the legal authority collapses, the Treasury may be forced to refund money that businesses have already passed through prices, contracts, and investment decisions. Warren Buffett warned that tariffs are an act of war, to some degree. He later told Berkshire Hathaway shareholders that trade should not be used as a weapon. His logic was simple. Once commerce becomes a weapon, every rational trading partner begins paying for protection from the country holding it. Canada saw that trap before Washington did. It stopped trying to win a symmetrical tariff fight. It removed broad counter tariffs that were raising costs inside Canada, preserved protection around strategic industries, and began using American pressure as the political justification for infrastructure that would reduce American leverage permanently. When you see how $175 billion, 71 found 7%, and $6 billion fit together, you will understand why the policy designed to make Canada more dependent may be accelerating the precise opposite outcome. Hit subscribe because the next stage of this conflict will not be decided by the country announcing the largest tariff. It will be decided by the country that escapes the trap first. Let me give you the full context, because the trap did not begin with a court ruling or a refund check. It began when tariffs were asked to perform too many jobs at the same time. The administration presented tariffs as a way to protect American industries, force production back into the United States, reduce trade deficits, punish unfair foreign practices, raise federal revenue, and create negotiating leverage. Any one of those objectives can justify a policy debate. The problem appears when the objectives begin contradicting one another. A tariff designed to eliminate imports cannot simultaneously produce permanent revenue from those same imports. A tariff designed to force a foreign company to lower its price cannot guarantee that an American factory using the imported material will remain competitive. A tariff intended to reduce the trade deficit may strengthen the dollar, weaken American exports, or redirect trade through other countries without restoring domestic production. A tariff used as a negotiating threat must eventually be removed if the negotiation succeeds. But a government that begins relying on the revenue develops a financial reason not to remove it. That contradiction remained partially hidden in 2025 because customs revenue rose dramatically. One analysis found that tariff collections reached approximately $264 billion that year, accounting for about 4.5% of total federal receipts, compared with roughly 1.6% over the preceding decade. The money gave the policy an immediate, measurable result. Imports crossed the border. Customs collected the tax. The Treasury recorded the revenue. Political leaders could point to a number and describe it as foreign countries paying America. But tariffs are not invoices mailed to foreign governments. They are charged to the companies bringing goods into the United States. Those importers decide whether to absorb the cost, demand a discount from the foreign supplier, raise the customer's price, reduce employment, delay investment, or redesign the supply chain. The burden can be distributed, but it does not disappear. According to a New York Federal Reserve analysis summarized by Reuters, nearly 90% of the increased tariff burden was ultimately carried by American businesses and consumers. That is the first wall of the trap. The tariff is advertised as pressure applied outside the country. Much of the financial pressure lands inside it. Canada faced the same problem from the opposite direction. When Washington imposed new duties on Canadian products, Ottawa responded with 25% counter tariffs on broad lists of American goods. One group of measures covered approximately $30 billion in imports. Another covered roughly $14.2 billion. Combined, the broad retaliation reached $44.2 billion. Canada also imposed measures connected to steel, aluminum, and automobiles, where the industrial stakes were concentrated. The political purpose was clear. Canada needed to demonstrate that unilateral American action would carry a cost. Counter tariffs could place pressure on particular industries, companies, and congressional districts. They gave Ottawa bargaining chips and showed Canadian workers that their government would not simply absorb the blow. But Ottawa soon encountered the same economic reality confronting Washington. Canadian importers paid Canadian tariffs. Some of those importers were manufacturers relying on specialized American equipment or components. Some were retailers with limited substitute suppliers. Some were farmers, builders, and small businesses. Canada could punish American exporters, but it could not prevent part of that punishment from passing through its own economy. A process was established for tariff remission because companies began demonstrating that the countermeasures could damage Canadian operations. A policy designed to impose pain on the United States was creating administrative work to prevent that pain from becoming permanent inside Canada. This was where the strategies began to diverge. Canada removed the broad counter tariffs in September 2025, but retained measures on steel, aluminum, and automobiles, while the corresponding American barriers remained. Ottawa was no longer trying to match every tariff with another tariff. It was separating symbolic retaliation from strategic protection. At the same time, the structure of Canadian trade began moving. According to Statistics Canada, the American share of Canadian merchandise exports fell from 75.9% in 2024 to 71.7% in 2025. Exports to countries other than the United States increased 17.2%. Total merchandise trade with non-American partners rose from $484 billion to $553 billion. Canada remained deeply dependent on the United States, but the direction had changed. Ottawa then placed public money behind that change. $5 billion was assigned to a Trade Diversification Corridors Fund for ports, railways, airports, bridges, roads, and highways. Another $1 billion was directed toward Arctic infrastructure with civilian and military uses. $6 billion in total. The stated objective was to make overseas trade physically possible, not merely diplomatically desirable. The new capacity was already becoming visible. The expanded Trans Mountain system could move approximately 890,000 barrels per day toward the Pacific, nearly 3 times its previous capacity. Along, Canada began shipping directly to Asian markets. Canada adopted a strategy to double overseas exports over a decade, potentially creating $300 billion in additional trade. This was the turning point. Washington was measuring how much pain Canada could absorb today. Canada was beginning to measure how much less pain Washington could impose tomorrow. And inside an Ottawa strategy room, the entire conflict could be reduced to a diagram with 3 arrows and no good exit for the country imposing the tariffs. What follows is a reconstruction based on public trade data, government policy documents, court decisions, budget records, and the strategic actions that followed. It is not presented as a transcript of a verified private meeting. The physical scene and dialogue are illustrative. The economic decisions are documented. The room is narrow and windowless. A long polished table runs beneath recessed ceiling lights. There are 12 chairs, but only 9 are occupied. Paper folders sit beside open laptops. Coffee has been poured into white government issue cups and left untouched long enough for a thin dark line to form around the inside of the porcelain. At one end of the room, a digital display shows 2 national flags and a series of customs tables. At the other, a physical map of North America has been mounted on a foam board. Red lines run south from nearly every Canadian production region: Ontario into Michigan, Ohio, and New York; Alberta into the American Midwest; Quebec into New England; Saskatchewan into farm country; British Columbia into Washington State. The map explains the vulnerability before anyone speaks. The first slide contains the number 75.9%. The second contains 71.7%. The difference is only 4.2 percentage points. No one in the room describes it as independence. 71.7% still means that more than 7 out of every $10 in Canadian merchandise exports go to the United States. An American tariff can still reach Canadian payrolls, provincial revenues, factories, farms, and retirement savings with extraordinary speed. But the direction matters. The next slide shows the increase in exports outside the United States. 17.2%. Beside it is a map of Pacific and Atlantic destinations: Europe, Japan, South Korea, India, Southeast Asia, the United Kingdom. The numbers remain much smaller than the Southern trade relationship, but they are no longer theoretical. A senior official asks for the tariff model. The screen changes. 3 columns appear. The first is labeled Raise. The second is labeled Keep. The third is labeled Remove. Under Raise, analysts have listed the consequences of another American escalation: higher costs for U.S. importers, greater incentives for foreign suppliers to reroute trade, more pressure on Canadian exporters, more political support in Canada for the $6 billion infrastructure program, more demand for government financing, port capacity, alternative customers, and domestic processing. Under Keep, the consequences are slower, but more dangerous. Tariff revenue continues. So do price pressures, legal challenges, uncertainty, exemptions, supply chain adjustments, and the gradual loss of trust. Canadian businesses receive more time to sign overseas contracts. Canadian governments receive more time to construct physical alternatives. A temporary negotiating weapon begins creating permanent commercial behavior. Under Remove, Washington avoids some domestic costs, but loses the visible instrument of pressure. Customs revenue falls. Political leaders must explain why tariffs presented as indispensable are being reduced. Businesses that already moved suppliers do not necessarily return. Canada keeps the infrastructure built during the confrontation. The official looks at the 3 columns for several seconds. Raise, Keep, Remove. There is no clean path. That is the trap. The tariff may be effective enough to cause damage, but not effective enough to produce surrender. It may generate enough revenue to become politically difficult to remove, but not enough to compensate for the economic costs. It may protect one upstream producer while weakening several downstream manufacturers. It may encourage investment in the United States, but it may also make American production more expensive when factories require imported metals, machinery, minerals, or components. The next slide contains another number: $175 billion. That was the approximate amount of revenue placed at risk after the Supreme Court ruled on February 20th, 2026, that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act did not authorize the President to impose tariffs. The court described the challenged measures as unbounded in scope, amount, and duration. The administration had used emergency authority to build a central part of its tariff wall. The legal foundation had failed. A legal advisor places a printed copy of the decision on the table. The document is thick. Its pages are clipped together in the upper left corner. Several passages are highlighted. No one reads them aloud. The number on the screen carries more immediate weight. $175 billion. Money already collected. Money recorded as federal revenue. Money importers now had a legal basis to reclaim. The room shifts to a second financial slide. June 2026. Gross customs duties, $23.6 billion. Tariff refunds, $49.2 billion. Net tariff result, negative $25.6 billion. The federal government recorded a $120 billion monthly budget deficit, compared with a surplus in the same month 1 year earlier. The visual is devastating. A policy sold as a source of revenue has become a line of refunds. The same importers who paid the duties may have already raised prices or changed contracts. The government must return the money. But there is no simple mechanism requiring every economic effect to reverse with it. A vehicle price increased because tariffs raised expected costs. A supplier contract was canceled. Inventory was purchased early. A plant was delayed. A customer switched brands. A pension fund marked down a company exposed to trade uncertainty. The refund can return the customs payment. It cannot return the decision. The Canadian officials now turn away from the American revenue table and back toward their own map. A folder marked Counter Tariffs lies open near the center of the table. Inside are lists worth $44.2 billion. Products selected to create political and economic pressure. Products that Canadian importers were also paying more to obtain. Beside it is another folder marked Strategic Industries. Steel, aluminum, automobiles, the distinction is visible. The broad folder represents retaliation across the economy. The strategic folder represents industries where lost capacity may not return after the dispute ends. One hand closes the broad folder. The strategic folder remains open. No speech follows. 5 seconds. Then 10. The sound of the folder closing is quieter than the hum of the ventilation system. But everyone in the room understands the meaning. Canada will not spend unlimited domestic capital, proving that it can mirror an American tax. It will remove the measures that impose diffuse costs inside Canada, preserve pressure where industrial capacity is genuinely at risk, and redirect political energy toward reducing dependence. The final slide appears. It contains 3 anchoring numbers: $175 billion, 71 found 7%, $6 billion. The first measures the legal and fiscal vulnerability of the American strategy. The second measures the remaining concentration of Canadian trade. The third measures the beginning of Canada's physical response. A line is drawn from $175 billion to the word refunds. Another is drawn from 71.7% to the word exposure. A third is drawn from $6 billion to the word exit. The reconstructed conclusion is cold and precise. Washington is trapped between the revenue it wants, the economic pressure it needs, the legal authority it lacks, and the alternatives its pressure is financing. Canada does not have to defeat the tariff. It has to outlast the period during which the tariff can determine every Canadian decision. The display goes dark. For several seconds, the room is illuminated only by laptop screens and the narrow green light above the door. Then one final instruction is entered into the planning document: reduce the cost of retaliation, preserve strategic capacity, and make 71.7% lower before the next confrontation begins. The immediate aftermath appeared chaotic because several parts of the trap began closing at once. The Supreme Court decision removed the emergency law foundation from the broad tariffs. More than $175 billion became potentially refundable. Customs authorities began processing claims. In May and June, refunds reached approximately $71 billion. By June alone, the government returned $2 billion, while collecting $23.6 billion in gross customs duties. The administration moved rapidly toward other statutory authorities, including Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. But those mechanisms require investigations, findings, procedural steps, and country or practice-specific justification. They may provide a more durable legal route, but they do not reproduce the unlimited speed and scope claimed under emergency authority without inviting another round of litigation. The $175 billion did not simply disappear from the political calculation. Tariffs had already become part of the federal revenue story. Researchers estimated that the policies could raise hundreds of billions of dollars over the coming decade, but projected receipts declined over time as American purchasers shifted away from highly taxed imports. That decline reveals the fiscal contradiction. The government earns the most revenue when Americans continue buying foreign goods, while the industrial policy is supposed to make them stop. Canada, meanwhile, did not deliver the concession Washington expected. On July 16, 2026, U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer said Canada still had not offered trade concessions and that formal negotiations had not begun, despite regular communication between officials. The U.S. trade deficit with Canada had already fallen 21% to approximately $48.3 billion, partly because of lower oil imports. Yet the lower deficit had not produced a settlement, and the removal of broad Canadian counter-tariffs had not produced political submission. That is the devastating irony. Canada's response was called weak because it removed broad retaliation. But nearly a year after that removal, Washington's senior trade official was still complaining that Ottawa had not made concessions. The United States also declined to renew the USMCA in its existing form during the July 1 review, beginning a 10-year countdown while seeking substantial changes. The agreement remained in force, but the decision introduced uncertainty into approximately $1.6 trillion in annual North American trade. Auto companies warned that stricter origin requirements could increase costs. Farm groups emphasized the value of Canadian and Mexican markets. Businesses planning factories with 20 or 30-year lives were asked to rely on rules placed under a 10-year cloud. Canada's economy was not protected from the damage. Goods exports to the United States fell 15.7% following major tariff announcements in April 2025. Canadian manufacturers lost orders. Automotive and metals producers faced pressure. Economic growth weakened, and workers in trade-exposed industries carried the uncertainty directly. But 71.7% showed that adjustment was occurring. Canada's non-American exports increased. Trans Mountain provided 890,000 barrels per day of Pacific capacity. Long Canada began serving Asian markets. $6 billion was assigned to corridors that could convert political diversification into actual volume. The contrast could not have been more severe. Washington was reconstructing a tariff wall after its legal foundation failed. Canada was constructing ports, railways, roads, terminals, and customer relationships, designed to matter regardless of which tariff statute survived. And then Buffett's warning translated the entire confrontation into language any investor could understand. Buffett said that over time, tariffs become a tax on goods. That is the economic translation of the first part of the trap. The tax may be imposed at the border, but the cost moves through the American company importing the product. Some foreign suppliers lower prices. Some importers accept smaller margins. But when nearly 90% of the additional burden is ultimately carried by American firms and consumers, the idea that the foreign country simply pays becomes impossible to sustain. The second part is the revenue contradiction. A tariff creates revenue only while the taxed import continues entering the country. If the tariff successfully eliminates the import, the revenue disappears. If imports continue, the government collects money but has not fully achieved the reshoring objective. If the tariff becomes extremely high, purchasers seek exemptions, alternative classifications, different suppliers, domestic substitutes, or routes through lower tariff markets. The tariff, therefore, contains the seeds of its own decline. The higher the rate, the stronger the incentive to avoid the transaction that generates the revenue. This is not unique to tariffs. Buffett has spent a lifetime explaining that incentives produce behavior. Raise the cost of an activity. and people attempt to change the activity. Make one supplier unreliable and companies search for another. Make one customer abusive and the seller accepts lower margins elsewhere to reduce dependence. In more than 60 years of allocating capital, buying companies, and assessing managers, Buffett repeatedly preferred systems that remained rational under pressure. A business model that functions only while customers have no alternative is not a durable competitive advantage. It is a temporary imbalance. That principle applies directly to the Canada relationship. The American market is an extraordinary asset for Canadian companies. It is wealthy, close, familiar, and connected by established infrastructure. Canada cannot reproduce those advantages in Europe or Asia. Shipping farther costs more. Foreign standards create complexity. New customers require time and trust. But a customer does not need to be replaced completely for its leverage to decline. It only needs to become less irreplaceable. The movement from 75.9% to 71. 7% is small enough to dismiss politically and large enough to matter strategically. Every percentage point represents trade that no longer depends on one border. Every new buyer changes the calculation behind the next threat. The $6 billion corridor investment operates like Buffett's cash reserve. Cash often looks unproductive during stable markets. It earns less than a perfectly chosen asset. But when conditions deteriorate, liquidity becomes the ability to act while everyone else is forced to accept bad terms. A second port, another rail connection, Pacific pipeline capacity, an LNG terminal, or a certified European buyer may look less efficient than the direct American route during stable times. During a tariff confrontation, the same redundancy becomes bargaining power. Buffett's concept of a margin of safety applies here. Canada's old trade structure was efficient, but carried very little margin of safety. 75.9% of merchandise exports depended on one country whose political leadership could alter border conditions through executive action. Canada's response is not to abandon efficiency entirely. It is to purchase enough redundancy that one decision in Washington cannot determine the fate of every major Canadian sector simultaneously. The third part of the trap is permanence. A tariff can be signed into existence and removed later. A supply chain cannot be reconstructed as easily. Once a Canadian company qualifies a European customer, that relationship remains available. Once an Asian utility receives Canadian ling, it knows how to contract, finance, insure, and ship another cargo. Once a port is expanded or a pipeline enters service, the capacity becomes part of every future negotiation. The United States may remove the tariff. It does not automatically remove the alternative created because of it. And that leads to the Buffett-style verdict. A policy that produces revenue today by financing the customer's escape tomorrow is consuming its own economic value. The $175 billion placed at risk by the court decision is visible. The movement to 71.7% is quieter. The $6 billion corridor program is slower, but the quiet and slow consequences are the ones most likely to survive. The cascading consequences begin with American industry. Steel tariffs may support domestic steelmakers, but steel is also an input for vehicles, machinery, construction, energy infrastructure, appliances, and defense systems. Aluminum supports smelters but also enters aircraft, automobiles, packaging, power systems, and electronics. A tariff can protect an upstream producer while raising costs for a larger number of downstream employers. The effect does not appear in one clean statistic. It appears through reduced margins, postponed hiring, altered sourcing, higher bids, and products that become less competitive abroad. The second consequence is the household burden. Estimates vary according to the policies included, but major tax policy analyses have placed the average annual household cost in the hundreds or more than $1,000. Lower-income households can face a larger increase relative to income because tariffs apply heavily to goods and production inputs. Services are affected indirectly because hospitals, professional firms, public agencies, and other service providers purchase taxed equipment, chemicals, computers, metals, vehicles, and energy-related products. For retirees, the cost arrives twice. It appears in prices paid for goods and services. It also appears inside investment portfolios when companies face higher input costs, uncertain contracts, legal disputes, and weaker growth. A single monthly tariff refund does not repair those long-term effects. The third consequence is fiscal. The $175 billion refund exposure demonstrates that revenue collected under uncertain authority cannot be treated like ordinary tax receipts. June's $49.2 billion refund wave helped turn customs duties into a $25.6 billion net monthly loss. The federal government was effectively paying back a revenue stream that had already influenced budget discussions and political claims. If Washington rebuilds the tariff wall under slower statutory authorities, the revenue may resume. But the underlying contradiction remains. To generate customs revenue, imports must continue. To claim full industrial success, imports must decline. The government cannot maximize both objectives indefinitely. The fourth consequence is Canadian economic restructuring. The $6 billion Trade and Arctic Corridor program will be invested in assets with operating lives measured in decades. Trans Mountain's 890,000 barrel capacity already gives Western Canadian oil access to Pacific markets. LNG Canada creates a direct route to Asia. Atlantic ports connect Canadian exporters to Europe under established trade agreements. Not every project will succeed. Some will exceed budgets. Some will encounter permitting delays. Some overseas sales will produce smaller margins than American contracts. But the strategic objective does not require every project to succeed. It requires enough alternatives to move 71.7% lower. The fifth consequence is political pressure across American states. Canada is not only a foreign supplier. It is one of the largest customers for American farmers, manufacturers, and service providers. Border states depend on integrated energy and production systems. Michigan and Ontario share automotive supply chains. New York and New England use Canadian power and energy. Agricultural states sell into Canadian markets. A tariff that appears to punish Ottawa can reduce an order in Ohio, raise a cost in Michigan, or delay an investment in Pennsylvania. The national political benefit can become a regional economic liability. The sixth consequence is institutional erosion. The USMCA entered force in 2020 as a replacement for NAFTA and was presented as a stable foundation for North American commerce. Declining to renew it in its current form only 6 years later sends a message to every company calculating the life of a factory. Even an agreement negotiated by the current political movement may not survive the next review unchanged. Institutional credibility does not vanish all at once. It is discounted. A company assumes more risk. A lender demands a higher return. A board delays approval. A supplier builds duplicated capacity. The agreement may remain legally operative while becoming economically less valuable. The seventh consequence is defense. NORAD depends on deeply integrated American and Canadian capabilities for aerospace warning, aerospace control, and maritime warning. Five Eyes intelligence cooperation connects the two countries with the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand. Arctic security depends on ports, airfields, roads, communications, energy, metals, and critical minerals. Canada's $1 billion Arctic Infrastructure Fund explicitly includes dual civilian and military applications. That can strengthen continental defense. But it also reflects a larger Canadian desire for sovereign logistical capacity. When trade becomes coercive, governments begin asking which military supply chains could be exposed to the same political pressure. A specialty metal may cross the border several times during production. A radar project may depend on components sourced through both countries. A procurement dispute can delay modernization. Tariff uncertainty may not end NORAD or Five Eyes. but it raises the cost of maintaining the seamless integration those institutions require. The eighth consequence is international. Japan watches Canadian energy moving through the Pacific. Europe watches Canada invest in Atlantic access. Australia, the United Kingdom, and South Korea see an allied country building redundancy against American policy risk. The question asked in foreign capitals is not whether the United States remains powerful. It clearly does. The question is whether access to American markets and systems can still be treated as predictable. If Canada, America's closest integrated partner, requires a $6 billion insurance policy against Washington, every other ally has reason to examine its own exposure. China and Russia benefit without needing Canada to abandon the Western alliance. They benefit when allies devote capital to protecting themselves from American uncertainty. They benefit when North American governments argue over trade, while Arctic, technological, and industrial competition intensifies. They benefit when institutional trust is replaced by contingency planning. That is the ultimate irony. The tariff policy was designed to demonstrate American strength. Its domestic burden was carried largely by American firms and consumers. It was designed to produce federal revenue. More than $175 billion became exposed to refunds, and June customs activity produced a $25.6 billion net loss. It was designed to force Canadian concessions. Washington was still publicly complaining that Canada had offered none. It was designed to prove Canada had no alternative. Canada's U.S. export concentration fell to 71.7%, while Ottawa committed $6 billion to building additional routes. The precise opposite of the intended strategic outcome is appearing beneath the surface. The situation is not merely difficult from several directions. Each problem amplifies the others. Domestic costs weaken political support. Legal uncertainty weakens revenue. Revenue dependence makes removal harder. Continued tariffs accelerate Canadian diversification. Diversification weakens future leverage. Lower leverage creates pressure for higher tariffs. Higher tariffs intensify domestic costs. That is a feedback loop. That is the trap. And once a policy enters a feedback loop, applying more of the same pressure can make escape harder rather than easier. Washington believed the tariff was a trap being placed around Canada. Canada recognized that the trap could close around the country imposing it. More than $175 billion in collected revenue became vulnerable when the legal foundation failed. American companies and consumers carried nearly 90% of the added burden. The government returned $49, $2 billion in 1 month, while collecting less than half that amount in gross duties. The Continental Agreement entered a 10-year countdown, and the Canadian concessions Washington expected still did not arrive. Meanwhile, 75.9% became 71.7%. $6 billion moved toward ports, railways, roads, airports, bridges, and Arctic infrastructure. 890,000 barrels a day gained access to a Pacific route. Canada did not win the trade war. Its economy absorbed real damage. Workers lost orders and security. Manufacturers faced higher costs and uncertainty. The American market remains too valuable and too close to replace. But Canada understood the distinction between surviving a tariff and defeating the leverage behind it. A tariff can be removed. Dependence is more difficult to remove. That is why Ottawa stopped measuring success by how much pain it could return and began measuring how much less exposed it could become. The philosophical lesson is the same one Buffett has applied across a lifetime of investing. A decision is not intelligent because it produces immediate cash. It is intelligent only if the cash exceeds the permanent damage required to obtain it. Revenue is not value. Activity is not progress. Pressure is not leverage when it teaches the other party how to live without you. Washington can rebuild the tariff wall under another law. It can impose new rates, negotiate exemptions, demand origin rules, and continue using access to the American market as a bargaining instrument. The United States remains the larger economy and holds enormous power, but every additional use now carries a compounding cost. Watch the $175 billion refund exposure. Watch 71.7%. Watch where the $6 billion is converted into physical capacity. Those three numbers measure three different parts of the same conflict: the instability of the tariff, the vulnerability Canada is reducing, and the infrastructure that may make that reduction permanent. The court has exposed the legal trap. The refunds have exposed the fiscal trap. The domestic burden has exposed the consumer trap. Canada's diversification has exposed the strategic trap. Washington can still raise the tariff. It can no longer assume that doing so improves its position. The corridors are being built. The contracts are moving. The concentration is falling. And every day the tariff remains in place, the exit Canada saw first becomes more expensive to close.